I don't know if it's just me, but so far 2024 has felt like the year of the survival game, honestly. With titles like Palworld and Enshrouded releasing to great success. I mean, Palworld peaked at like over 2 million concurrent players, which put it in second place of all time, just behind PUBG. And Enshrouded, while a much smaller game in comparison, capping out at 160,000 concurrent, I'll just say I personally enjoyed that game a whole lot more, thanks to it feeling like a good old-fashioned RPG adventure on top of the survival elements. And then, of course, there was Sons of the Forest, which after a year of updates and improvements left early access into full release and seems to be trucking along nicely. And we also saw Nightingale release into early access, although unfortunately that one didn't quite land as well as I had hoped. Let's see if they can turn that ship around in the coming years. So yeah, we're only a couple months into the year and already fans of the survival genre have a lot on their plate. Well, strap in because there's another contestant stepping into the arena with the hopes of being crowned the best new survival game of 2024, and that is quite a tall order given, as I just went over, all of the great games that we've seen thus far. I'm talking about Dune Awakening, the open-world survival sandbox MMO being developed by Funcom. This is a studio that is quite established in both genres this game is dipping its toes into. Their MMO lineage goes all the way back to 2001 when they released Anarchy Online, followed by Age of Conan and The Secret World in subsequent years. And then of course they've got their survival game, Conan Exiles, which launched in 2018 and is probably the studio what they're best known for, as well as being their most successful release. Funcom has stated on numerous occasions that with Dune Awakening, their hope, their goal is to take the past 20 years of experience in both of these genres and bring them together in what they are hoping is their best game yet. And yeah, I am hoping for that too. I've been keeping a close eye on this one since it was announced about 2 years ago, and news really has been ramping up recently. Beta testing, we know, is currently underway. Things are going well, at least according to the developer, and it looks like they are still on track to release the game later this year. On the surface, when you take a look at its features and planned content, Dune Awakening does sound like a pretty promising premise. Beyond the basics of what we have known and covered in prior videos, they recently held a 30-minute showcase providing a whole lot more detail and some gameplay footage. They're describing this game as their take on survival in an open-world sandbox while harkening back to the days of traditional MMORPGs. For the survival elements, these will include the traditional beginnings of starting out with nothing and then venturing out to gather the things needed to survive. You'll be collecting water from plants and bodies to stave off thirst, keeping in the shade to reduce water consumption, avoiding or engaging with enemy NPCs as well as other players, collecting loot, and even taking shelter from its deadly sandstorms. Then of course there is going to be crafting. You'll be gathering resources, various forms of stone, plants, and metals, which you will then use to build up an arsenal of weapons, gear, clothing. There's base building and even vehicle construction. You'll go through the typical survival loop, starting out with nothing, gathering the basic resources to craft basic tools, then build basic crafting stations, which lets you progress into the next tier to gather better resources to craft better tools, so on and so on and so on. As for the game's MMO elements, well, for one, they've said that servers will be supporting up to thousands of players simultaneously and will feature endgame that's centered around this large-scale combat with groups of players split into various factions, all fighting for resources in what they are calling all-out ground and air warfare, combined arms, similar to what you see in games like Battlefield or PlanetSide. You'll have people running around on foot doing shooting, melee, casting abilities and stuff, and then people in various ground and air vehicles coming into the fray as well at a massive scale. For the game's combat, it is a third-person action shooter type of a game. You'll pick from a wide array of crafted weapons, gadgets, vehicles, gear, and abilities from different great schools of the Imperium, which is basically the Dune's universe's take on magic systems. This will also be tied into various progression and leveling systems where you unlock new abilities with time. So what they've said is that when you make a character, you will select who your mentor is, and this is sort of like picking a starting class. It's going to determine the abilities you begin with, and then as you play, you level up, unlocking new skills along the way. But then also out in the world, you're going to find various trainers who have their own abilities, and they will teach these to you after you complete certain tasks for them. So after you do a couple of quests or build up their reputation or something like that. In terms of the game's overall combat, they refer to it I mentioned it a moment ago, but they're calling this combined arms. It consists of some combination of melee, ranged abilities, and vehicles. Each of these elements players can utilize at various times in combat. They can specialize in them. You can specialize in being a melee character with melee focused abilities, ranged, scout, etc. There's going to be a lot of kind of specialization within the different roles that you can fulfill. And the game's world, combat plays a big role in it. You know, you start off with little, you go out, you adventure, take on some PvE threats. Eventually, you'll find yourself in PvP scenarios. The world is going to be divided into multiple separate sections, which can be boiled down to safe areas and hostile regions. And in those hostile areas, you'll of course find highly valuable resources and loot, but at the same time, it's going to be full-on, all-out PvP. And they've even mentioned that friendly fire exists in the game, so you best be careful where you're pointing that gun. Another big part of the Dune game is going to be the environment, but then also the large creatures within them. And I'm explicitly talking about sandworms here, because besides other players and factions of enemy NPCs, sandworms exist as this omnipresent threat while playing the game. They are drawn by player activity and especially alerted during combat. They have actually referred to this, their implementation of sandworms, as a tension mechanic that forces players to think about their actions for fear of drawing the worm's attention, because there are two things to keep in mind. Number one, you can't kill sandworms. No matter what you do, no matter what weapons you have, they ain't dying. The only thing that you can really do is try to avoid them. So they're going to be smaller sandworms, which will be drawn to and chase down individual players or small groups of players, but then also the giant ringmouth sandworms that show up at large events like faction battles and wars that take place over spice, which is the game's highly coveted resource used for a lot of the various progression and crafting systems. These ones are said to be so large that they will be in fact swallowing entire buildings. I'm curious how that's going to be implemented in the game, but it sounds like a cool premise. And then you can also use distracting techniques, like you can call in thumpers, which will direct a sandworm, either drawing it away from somewhere you want to be, or maybe you place a thumper down by other players where you want the sandworm to go and mess up their day. There's going to be a kind of a lot of play here with the environment and calling the sandworms to and away from you. You can also use vehicles to avoid or escape the sandworms, like ornithopters have you flying in the air. That's obviously a great way to avoid them. Or if you have a sand bike, you can use that to run away when you know that a sandworm is incoming. And then the sands themselves are going to be changing the environment and the play space. So apparently there's going to be specific areas of the game subject to the shifting sands feature, where once a week, acting like a weekly reset, these sandstorms will roll in, completely changing the environment and the landscape in these regions. They can wipe out player outposts, cover up and reveal brand new points of interest, highly valuable resource locations, various spots for loot, all sorts of potential here. This is actually a really interesting sounding system, and I like that they have this thematic way to provide these dynamic areas where every week new points of interest will show up, old ones will go away, player constructed buildings within these areas will potentially get swallowed up, although do keep in mind there is safety regions of the world, so there are safe areas where you can build a base, but then you can essentially build a base out in the wild to more easily ferry your goods or whatever, or provide shelter while you're out exploring. But you have to realize that those will not be permanent structures, because the incoming shifting sands and even the sandworms could at some point get rid of them. Speaking of base building, there will of course be base building in this game. In fact, the developer said that they took the systems used in their other survival game, Conan Exiles, and have that as the base foundation for the crafting and building, but they have further improved and added upon it. So it's going to be a template style of building. You're not placing down like individual tiles, but rather taking these templates and putting down a floor chunk, a wall chunk, roofs, stairs, all of the usual fare. You can then also construct various forms of refining stations, crafting stations, and production facilities. There's going to have co-op building in the game, and this will be facilitated through these holograms that let your allies see and contribute to a construction. So for example, if you place down a workbench, that might require some combination of stone and metal. You and other players can then fill those requirements. Once they're full, the bench is complete and constructed. You can also, as you're building a base, you can create blueprints, which you can then either gift to your friends or even sell to other players on the game's in-game exchange, basically like an auction house. And as I mentioned, there will be different types of base building. You will have these permanent base structures that you can build in safe locations, but there will also be more on-the-go structures that you build while out exploring the dunes of Arrakis. They've even mentioned how you can have base defense, like by generating a personal shield just for your base to help protect it from sandstorms and enemy players as well. The game's going to feature plenty of co-op as well. You can group up and explore with others. They have an in-game ping system to let you point stuff out. about. I really like that this has been more widely implemented in games without having to use VoIP, being able to communicate with people in your party without having to chat, without having to type it out. It's just a really nice feature. I'm glad they're including it. And they also really try to emphasize the fact that while playing as a group, you can fill different roles. And this is going to apply in a variety of contexts. So this applies in like the exploration and combat context, where depending on the abilities that you're using, you can be more offensive, more defensive, and more support. But this also applies more widely to how you play the game, with you able to fill different roles that are beyond combat or beyond just gathering resources and doing the general survival loop. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. They also say they have a journey system and a system of contracts, which basically just sound like variations of questing, of different tasks that you can complete for various resources, experience, reputation gain. And they have mentioned that they are going to make sure to try to fulfill various types of content for both small groups, individual players, and then large-scale guild-focused activities and content. Politics are going to play a big role as well, as the game's overarching goal. The big thing that's focused here is this ongoing war between two factions, and at some point in progression, you as a player will pick which side, which faction you want to fight for, and then you're going to partake in missions for that faction, working your way up the ranks with the opportunity to take a position of power for the most dedicated players. That sounds like a high warlord grind or something like that. You're just going to be grinding up the ranks for reputation, and there are going to be some top spots, although they have not yet clarified from what I've saw what that unlocks access to, other than maybe a title. Maybe there's more, but we just don't know. I just don't know as of yet. And then also they spent part of this presentation just talking a bit about the game's visuals. I gotta say, looks a lot better than what we saw in the early days. It definitely seems like through development they have progressed quite a bit on the visual front. They spoke a bit about some of the technical advantages that the Unreal Engine 5 gives them to try to make the game look really good. A lot of the same stuff that you hear pretty much from any developer using Unreal Engine 5, but they just recapped by saying, hey, Lumen is here to create natural looking lighting. This looks especially great indoors and even in player crafted buildings. And then of course Nanite, which breaks down high quality assets into lower poly versions based on player distance, rather than all the extra work that developers used to have to do to create these level of detail models, making different versions of all the game's assets depending on how far away the player was to them. So great features, great tech in UE5. Let's devs make games that look good. From what we're seeing in this most recent showcase, yeah, I think Dune Awakening looks pretty darn good. Now towards the end of the event, they also released a new gameplay trailer, which had quite a few clips showcasing some of these in-game features and content. So we saw the intro, the basic survival start, where players begin with nothing and then go out scavenging for resources. We saw one of those small sandworms emerging from the dunes and then chasing the player. We got some great examples of crafting, with a player building a suit of armor, placing down pieces of a base, and even constructing crafting stations. There were a few shots of some ground and air vehicles on display. We saw traversal systems with players climbing the side of the mountain, which looked cool. There were some high-tech gadgets on display. We saw air combat with an ornithopter. We saw a little bit of magic use, such as these players levitating, combined with a few quick combat clips. There was also a moment in the trailer where one large, what looked to be like a guild base being constructed, and then finally players scouting out one of these in-progress large-scale combined arms battles taking place. You see like little players running around with their guns. You see ground and air vehicles all combined with explosions and shooting and tracer rounds and abilities. I mean, if done right and if it runs well and if it plays well, that's a really cool, the idea of getting like a battlefield or a planet side inside of a survival sandbox MMO sounds great if they can actually deliver on the tech, on having gameplay that feels good and making sure it doesn't run like total garbage. If they can do that, that sounds really good. Most notably from the trailer, it did feature what looked to be a close representation of the Dune film's main actor, but not close enough for them to have to pay any of the likeness rights. It's just like, it's got like the curly hair and like this same general face shape. I just thought it was kind of funny. Now, following this, we also saw an interview released with PC Gamer, where Dune Awakening's creative director discussed how they're pulling a lot of inspiration from old school MMORPGs. He said that Star Wars Galaxies was a huge inspiration for us. That is the style of MMO we really like, the old sandboxy MMOs. Then World of Warcraft came out and everyone copied that for a few years. Yeah, just a few years, or still do. But a lot of us are old school MMO players. Funcom's been around for a while, even made one of the originals with Anarchy Online. After that, he went on to talk about the fact that a lot of the old school MMO design then kind of splintered off into other genres in the post-WoW era. And this is he's on point here. He said the crafting part of MMOs became survival games with smaller private servers. MOBAs were like the MMO PvP mini games back in the day. The survival elements are a different kind of funnel into the game, at least that's the way I think about it, but I don't think they're miles apart. We like that concept that this is where survival games are. They are the sandbox break off of MMOs, and we can bring that back. And yeah, I mean, in my opinion, he is spot on here with this idea that what was once a part of a larger combination of features that we saw included in many of the in the early MMORPGs. A lot of that got spun off into different genres over the years, because after the success of WoW, it seems pretty much every subsequent MMO, with but a few exceptions, has kind of followed along that theme park formula that Blizzard helped bring into the mainstream and popularize. And then instead of getting other new kinds of MMOs over these years, we've just seen parts of that genre get spun off and turn into more focused games. So yeah, MOBAs kind of took the place of MMO PvP and just removed that long character progression time investment of having to level up a character and then gear it up and then do the PvP. They said, hey, let's just do the PvP, make it round based, you get gear, you level up, but all within like a 30 to 60 minute time frame of an individual game. And then yeah, survival games kind of took that sandbox element of some of those early MMOs and then consolidated it and shrunk it down into an experience on a smaller and more refined scale. And so instead of getting a lot of actual large scale survival sandbox MMOs, we get smaller survival games and theme park MMOs, and that's how it is. And they've said here that with Dune Awakening, they're hoping to bring a lot of that old school MMO into the now established version of the survival genre, and they hope to do this with a larger scale and a diverse way to play the game. And that's where some of the more MMO elements are going to come into play. Beyond just the large number of players on a server, this is where that old school MMO inspiration is going to come into play with Dune Awakening, because they discussed in detail during that showcase how players can fill various roles in terms of how they play. Of course, combat will be a focus. You can focus on going out and questing and doing PvE and grinding and collecting resources and all that stuff. Or you can focus on the PvP, because a big part of the end game is going to be that big conflict with other players fighting over those valuable resources in that combined arms battlefield style gameplay. Those are going to play a big role in the game. It's even a focus of the end game. But in addition to that, or in exclusion of doing those things, you could choose to be a master crafter. You can specialize in making certain types of armor or weapons or tools and then sell the things you make on the game's exchange. You can also focus on being an architect, constructing these cool looking buildings of all sorts of different varieties and styles and selling those blueprints to other players. So instead of spending the several hours or days of making this really cool looking structure, they can just buy the blueprints, place the blueprints down, and then fill them up with the resources. But you can spend your playtime being the architect who builds those buildings and sells those blueprints. You could also focus on something like being a scout. They're going to have this system where you go out and explore the environment, and you can actually map out the world, placing the key location indicators for valuable resources and points of interest, and then you can craft maps that you sell to other players. I did not realize that this was a thing. I wonder if this is going to largely pertain to those areas where the shifting sands come in weekly and change the landscape. Maybe it's the case. It seems like it might be the case that those areas will not be mapped out in-game by default for the players, but you will have players who go out and adventure every week and map them out and craft these maps that you can then buy from them. That sounds pretty cool. And then I would be hesitant to neglect mentioning one final thing that I thought was really cool that he mentioned towards the end of the video, where he said that if the game director were here, he would be saying, if the game feels really good to play moment to moment, the way you move in the world, the way you shoot in the world, driving, if those things feel great, and then you have this amazing universe around it, it's gonna be fine. And I will say absolutely for sure, we don't know if they're gonna deliver, but I think it's so important that they are at least acknowledging and considering this, because those things, if done well, can absolutely make for a good base game. And then all of these supporting systems and features, if your world is interesting to explore and navigate, if you've got satisfying progression systems and engaging content that can keep people coming back, those things combined with the great feeling gameplay, the great movement, the great moment to moment, the great action, the great traversal, those things all coming together can then turn a good game into a great game. game. We don't know how Dune Awakening is going to turn out. If they nail the moment-to-moment, the action, the gameplay, the feel, the traversal, the immersive world, we don't know how it's going to go, but I am so happy to hear that they are at least acknowledging that those things are important, because yes, that is the key baseline to making a good game. And then if the rest comes into play, maybe you end up with a great game. So when are we going to get to play Dune Awakening? Well, as I mentioned, it is slated for release this year. They have said that closed beta tests have been running for several months now and that they are going well, according to the developer. Their plan is to slowly but surely invite more players over time, and they will be working with the community and taking feedback to help improve the game, yada yada, all the stuff you hear from any game that's in beta testing. If you are interested, there is registration available over on the official website. It is still open, and they did mention that we should expect to start seeing a lot more about the game as we progress throughout the year. They also mentioned that this event here, which was called Dune Awakening Direct, this was episode 1. There will be plenty more of these in the future as well. So I'll keep an eye out, and I will keep you guys up to date with any major and interesting new information that comes from them. I gotta say, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. I do like what we've seen of the game thus far, and I'm hoping it turns out well. Also hope that we see some sort of large-scale open testing prior to the game's release so we can get our hands on it and see if it plays well, if it runs well, and if all of these systems and features they've talked about end up resulting in an engaging gameplay loop. They certainly have some big shoes to fill, following on the back of Pal World, Enshrouded, and Sons of the Forest, if they want to be considered 2024's best new survival game. And well, we'll find out sometime later this year. But that is all for today. Thank you as always. Hope you enjoyed this update, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.